Joe. I've thought about this issue for many years, but this is the first time I've ever spoken about it in public, so you'll have to forgive me for what probably won't be a very coherent A to B to C to D talk. I'm hoping that it'll be the first of many, and I'm hoping that I shall also be writing about it. Speaking truth to power is, I believe, a central challenge for Friends. It's a core part, I think, of our discernment action cycle. And let me just describe to you what I think that cycle is, before also talking to you about some of the pitfalls and traps that come from speaking truth to power. This is not going to be an easy talk. I may say things at times that you might disagree with. It is deliberately provocative. I will be saying things that maybe have not been said in the society before. I think there are some really big challenges to the concept, and I would like Britain Uni Meeting to think again about its relationship to speaking truth to power. So that's a rider at the start. But let me describe to you the cycle. The cycle starts with us observing the world and interacting with it and feeling that somehow things are not quite right. And then we discern, we sit down, we reflect, we discern. Usually, often, that might be individually. And then when we come to a point of decision that we want to move, we bring this to our meeting or other corporate group, and we bring it up as a concern. And then there is a group discernment. The group discernment may remain within the local meeting, or it may go all the way to Britain Uni Meeting. But at some point, we adopt the concern, and then we think about action, and we think about how we can speak and how we can collectively operate. The testimony that came out of Britain Uni Meeting just a few weeks ago had a number of different dimensions here around discernment, and let me give you one bit of it here. We asked, how does the light push us into action? Quakers have a long tradition of testing concerns in local area and yearly meetings. Testing a concern may challenge not just the leading of one friend, but the commitment of the whole meeting, and lead to growth for everybody. Through the right use of this process, we can support our friends in their callings. So you can see here that there is a very central part of the collective discernment. We then, of course, once we collectively discern, we adopt the concern, and then we plan action. One of my challenges to the Speaking Truth to Power frame is that it immediately, by framing it in the way we do, puts us in opposition. We are in opposition. We are speaking truth to power. I looked at the Britain Uni Meeting's website yesterday, and there are a number of bits here with a number of calls to action. And all of them said no. No to Trident. No to TTIP. No to inequality. Even the positive one, conscientious objection, is no to war. It's a lot of no's, no's, no's. And in the testimony, we are, near the end, we say we have been challenged to consider whether we ought to be a prophetic voice crying in the wilderness, like John the Baptist, or take direct action in collaboration with others. That seems to me quite a polar or limited set of actions. When we come to act, we then obviously evaluate, are we doing effectively, and then eventually the concern is laid down, because there is a cycle, because we can't do everything all the time. Today I'm going to give you a personal set of reflections based upon my life. Hoping they are relevant, you can pick things out from my experience that I think are relevant to the question of where Britain Uni anything goes with truth to power. I started off as a young student, and by that I mean at school rather than college, passionate, realising that there's a lot wrong in the world. I took the admonition that we needed to speak truth to power seriously. I was desperate to judge right from wrong, and the world to me at the time was very much about right and wrong. I saw a lot of injustice, and it was my role to take it on. I remember distinctly a day when my brother came back from university. He was 7 years older than me. He talked about this burgeoning movement in 1979, the campaign for nuclear disarmament. I discovered about nuclear weapons at the age of 12, quite late on. And the overwhelming emotion I had was one of anger. Anger that a small group of old men could, in their games, take on the future of the world. And I saw it as a challenge to do the right thing. I think there were a lot of influences on me at the time. I could pick a number, I mean, particularly obviously my family, but also stories like the parable of the talents. You know, I was given a number of skills and talents, and it was up to me to use those for the benefit of the world. I think also quite soon afterwards, this country went to war against Argentina, and I was at the time attending a Church of England service every Sunday, and the vicar was sending out prayers to our boys down in the South Atlantic. And it struck me at the time that this was full of contradiction and full of hypocrisy, and did not sit well with the teachings of Christ. So I quickly found friends through the political stirrings in my consciousness at the time, going on nuclear disarmament demonstrations, action against. I joined, soon after college, I joined a think tank working on nuclear disarmament, the Oxford Research Group, and I got very active in the Green Party. These were all opportunities for me to join a tribe that I could feel reflected my values, and to campaign against things that I felt were wrong with the world. My activity in the Green Party was very much about challenging the mainstream political culture. And I had an incredible opportunity because at Oxford University we had passing through our fingers tomorrow's leaders, and we could influence them with political action at an early stage. And in this, I, by mistake, got elected, and then a few years later found myself running Oxford City Council as the co-leader, because we were the only Green Party in the country holding the balance of power. You could say I was the most powerful Green in the country. And every day I would walk into the City Council and instruct the Chief Executive on her day's work, the Chief Executive that I had appointed. And I very quickly came to realise what it's like to be in a position of power. I was lobbied. There were people whose lives, not lives, but their quality of lives, depended upon my decisions, day by day. I came to realise that things are more complicated than I thought they were. I came to realise that the machine metaphors that I was using, like if I do this here, then this will happen, and then the quality of the public service to our constituents would improve. And of course the complexity was far, far greater than that. I found that I had to balance principle with pragmatism. I came to realise that it was no longer a simple choice between what I thought was right and wrong and what actually happened day by day. I had to worry about my reputation as co-leader of the council. I had to think about how I was accountable to people who didn't agree with me. And a good example would be parking on the streets. You know, I was a radical, cars, but you know, I had to represent people who drove cars, and I had to represent people who had busy day-to-day lives that required them to have cars to operate effectively. I came to realise that I had come to adopt this position out of purity and anger, and those qualities were no longer appropriate, or at least not exclusively in that position. I came to realise that this had as much to do with relationships, an ongoing connection and love, than it had to do with me being right. And there was in there a tension. It was a creative tension. I was challenged, and should have been challenged, to remain true to the principles that got me elected in the first place. But I was also challenged to actually be softer with the people I was dealing with. That was a big wake-up call. A few years later, after I finished at the council and moved to London, I found myself appointed a chat show host on state Iranian television for 6 years. I had a weekly TV show. I was speaking to 1 million Iranians about sensitive political issues, from the nuclear program to their relationships with Europe. And I found myself at the beginning thinking, this is such an opportunity to speak truth to another culture that doesn't understand us. And I very quickly came to realise my arrogance, realising that actually Iranians knew more about British politics than most British people. Why? Because they want to know who it is that's likely to be bombing them next year. So I very quickly realised that I had to actually take a much more complex approach to this, a much more humble approach, and a questioning approach, an approach that made me realise that actually I was more effective in communicating with people if I understood where they came from, and that was more important, or as important, as realising where I came from. And that's, for me, a key lesson around speaking truth to power. If we really want to speak truth to power, the challenge is not only to come to understand where we are and where our relationship is with our God, but also where the people we are communicating with are. And I will talk a little bit more about that in a second, about some of the tools I ended up teaching. Because as well as becoming a TV chat show host, at the same time I was appointed by the British government to teach in the National School of Government systems approaches in their top management program. So they gave me some of their most senior civil servants to play with, play with their minds, and to get them to take them through for 3 days a number of tools that a colleague of mine and I developed to encourage systems thinking at the top level of government. I'm going to just talk you through 3 of these tools because they're quite simple and extremely powerful. And like most teachers, I taught them and then realised sometime in that I wasn't applying them to my own life. And that was when I realised actually I needed to shift. There's nothing like teaching to actually learn things from. So, tool 1, active listening. I'm sure some of you have done active listening. There's a number of different varieties, but I'm going to just talk you through one particular, and I'm going to be taking the children through this active listening exercise later on this morning. If you want to change somebody's mind, if you want to speak truth to power, the very worst thing you can do is shout at them, or to admonish them, or to be critical of them. Because the moment you do that, you create gulf between yourself and them, you put yourself on a pedestal, and you don't give them a good reason to listen. Now, the most powerful thing you can do if you want to convince somebody of your opinion is to shut up, and is to listen to them, and is to draw out their perspective. And the way you draw out their perspective is you ask them questions. You put them in power, you put them in control. And after asking them a few questions, you then reflect back to them their perspective in your words and check in with them that you've got it right. Hopefully you haven't got it perfectly right, because that then gives them an opportunity to correct you. So they then feel even more in control. And their barriers start to come down because they see that you're listening. And if you listen, genuinely listen, as in genuinely be prepared to give up your perspective and to agree with them, they then start to do the same in return. So the active listening exercise I took people through was I would get them to interview their partner for 5 minutes on their work-life balance in a conventional way. And then 5 minutes later we would do an exercise of active listening, where the interviewee would ask questions and then reflect back what they had heard and check in. It's a little bit like Quakers' business method and the minutes process. It's a very effective tool to ensure that we got it right. So, and I will give you an example in a minute of how I've applied this in my work. My second tool is what I call the criticalness exercise. It's the most difficult exercise I took them through, and it's the most simple. What I got them to do was I would get them to think about the 3 people they most admired in their life. I mean, really admired, not just thought they're good, but really admired. And then thought about the 3 qualities that those people had. And then I would get them to think about the 3 people they were most critical of, deeply critical. Usually it's your partner you live with. Deeply critical. And then think about the qualities that you're critical of. And once they've done that, I would challenge them to think about those 3 qualities that they admired, and to think that perhaps these are qualities that they haven't fully owned up to in their own life. And then to look at the 3 qualities they were critical of, and to think that perhaps these are 3 qualities that you have, that you haven't owned up to. It's a very difficult challenge if you really do it properly. And then tool number 3, one that I'm still developing and that I'm finding extraordinarily powerful, is what I call immunity to change. Now, every system, every human system, every system involving human beings has feedback loops that bring the system back to where it was before if there are any external shocks. And the reason why I can say that with confidence is because any system that didn't have those feedback loops would spiral off into another system. So everything we do, be it a nuclear weapons program or our day-to-day lives, if there's any external shock or attempt to change that system, there will be forces that bring that system back. And as a result of this, we often find that we are thwarted when we try to change systems. There are all sorts of feedback loops that keep the British nuclear weapons system going, which I could go into at great length. But there's all sorts of things that stop me from achieving the New Year's resolution that I have each New Year. Everybody does it. Well, not everybody, but most people. You have your New Year's resolution, you're going to change, you're committed to that change, you really want to give up smoking, whatever, and weeks later you failed. And the reason for that is because we focus too much on the desire to change and not enough on what it is that keeps us doing what we do. So there is this process called immunity to change, which acknowledges this, which identifies the competing commitments. So like with smoking, I have a commitment to relaxing at the end of the day. I have a commitment to giving myself a treat, because I'm a busy person and I do all sorts of things and I need a treat, and fags are a nice way of doing it. There's all sorts of competing commitments that get in the way, but we don't acknowledge them because we judge them as inappropriate. And smoking is bad. So I'm not going to face that. I'm just going to focus on the I want to give up smoking because it's bad for my health. But actually, you have to focus on the competing commitments, and you have to do so without judgment. And you then that gives you an opportunity to look at the assumptions that are underneath that with sympathy and respect, and then to start to realise what the world could be like if you just started to relax them. So it's not fighting, it's relaxing, it's being sympathetic with those competing commitments. So, I work now exclusively, pretty much, on nuclear disarmament. I talk to a lot of officials in Britain, in the US, in Moscow, in Tehran, in Saudi Arabia, all over the place. And what I come across is strong competing commitments to the desire to disarm. And I have come to realise that where before I judged these people for being hypocrites and not having the political commitment to disarmament, I realise that actually most of them do want to get rid of nuclear weapons, but they have other stronger competing commitments. Competing commitments like being seen as strong on defence by their electorate, or competing commitments around wanting to address the possibility that their competitor might blackmail them, with nuclear blackmail. These sit alongside the desire to get rid of nuclear weapons. So if I am serious about wanting to work with them, alongside them, to achieve nuclear disarmament, I have to surface those competing commitments, the belief in nuclear deterrence, that it works, and the like, and I have to work with them, through them, in order to try to encourage them to relax their attachment to those competing commitments. It doesn't work for me to go, nuclear weapons are immoral. Because they'll go, yes, you're right, they're immoral. Of course it's immoral to threaten millions of civilians, but we are elected in order to make the difficult choices. You know, we are elected to be mature and responsible and not to be black and white about these things. And my saying nuclear weapons are immoral actually simply strengthens their position, ironically. Or the current international movement to ban nuclear weapons on the basis that they have enormous humanitarian consequences. Yeah, yes, of course they have humanitarian consequences. That's the terror, that is the balance that we have to play with as decision makers. So, what is the challenge? The challenge is, how can I, as an individual that runs an organisation that has 3 or 4 people, have an impact on a nuclear weapons enterprise that involves many countries, hundreds of thousands of individuals, and billions of pounds? Power is not involved. I recently, a few years ago, engaged in an extended active listening exercise. It was an experiment. A lot of people thought I was mad. Maybe they still do. But I set up this thing called the Trident Commission. And I went along and I got Malcolm Rifkind and Des Brown and Min Campbell and a bunch of other people, the head of the army, recent head of the army, the head of the Royal Society. Now, the establishment. I populated it with the establishment. I sat them down for 3 years, many meetings with government officials, and we engaged in active listening. I challenged them to express their perspectives on a number of occasions. I clarified that perspective. I published a report in the name of the Commission, of which I'd completely disagreed, and expressed that establishment perspective on Britain's nuclear role, because I saw it as an essential step to building trust and to highlighting some of the discrepancies and inconsistencies within the official position, highlighting the complexity. And to this day, I'm now able to not only walk into the Ministry of Defence or Downing Street and to be respected, and they know where I'm coming from, but also that I'm willing to listen and to be open to their perspective. But also, it means that I'm able to draw stuff out of that report that they authored, that I authored, highlighting some of the inconsistencies in the existing position. So, in all of this, how does this relate to speaking truth to power? Well, my first thought here is that we often give our power away. Power, I can tell you, as somebody who has been in power, power is not all in one place. It is diffuse across the system. It is lumpy, a bit like those old-fashioned duvets, but it is nevertheless not all in one place. And by thinking that we are somehow small people and that there are big people who are in power, it means we are already giving away that power and making that a reality. So, back in 2006, Tony Blair wanted to renew Trident, and he wanted to nail the decision down early. He wanted to be the Prime Minister that made that decision because it would reinforce his project that New Labour would always be electable, as in not old Labour. And he challenged us within the peace movement to react against that. He was looking for a black and white, are you for or against Trident debate, that would then enable him to go, Labour is in favour of Trident. We have got rid of our old baggage, and we have at last completely developed a new political party. But we didn't give him that chance, those of us who were leading on some of the dynamics here. There was clearly a very strong anti-nuclear, anti-Trident reaction, but there was also a more subtle reaction that some of us engaged in, which was to say, we're not playing your game. We're going to engage here because we have power to frame this issue, we're going to engage in a reframing of the issue, and we're going to say, it's not the time. It's premature. We don't need to make this decision now. And the only reason why you're bringing this to the British public now and to Parliament is because you want your personal legacy and because BAE Systems wants their money. And I had a head-to-head debate in the Royal United Services Institute with Des Brown, who at that time was his Defence Secretary, responsible for steering this decision through Parliament. And Des had prepared for a debate for and against nuclear weapons. And what he got was, it's not the right time, you're being premature, these are the real reasons. And he said to me after the debate, Des, you won the debate there because you didn't accept the framing. And he started on a long journey, which now means that Des is working alongside me in and with my organisation. Because he saw that this was more than just a black and white issue. That this is about human beings, it's about politics, and it's about power that is more diffuse. Another reflection is that if we are always seeing ourselves as being anti and negative, people will always see us as anti and negative. And we need to be focused on the positive and the constructive. What does a world look like without nuclear weapons? How can we bring more love to the political process, to the way our society works? This is a more positive way of seeing. How can we not only recognise that our ecosystems are under threat, and that climate change will mean a huge devastation of the current way of doing things. But what are the opportunities here that climate change brings for us to move beyond the dysfunctional ways our society operates, so that there is more love, there is more community? Let's try and be more positive. Let's try and revisit the complexity that means that we understand better the dynamics that bring people to adopt what looks like particularly horrific defence policies. I think we could do more active listening. I think we could understand better, not just ourselves, but those we seek to influence. I think it's important that we focus not just on what we think to be right and wrong, but on the process beyond our traditional discernment process. I think, rather than speaking truth to power, we should be thinking about seeking truth, sharing power, and speaking together. And in doing this, we need to find and surface the competing commitments and have more sympathy for them. So let me go back to that quote from the Testament, from the Britain Union Meeting testimony. We have been challenged to consider whether we ought to be a prophetic voice crying in the wilderness, like John the Baptist, or take direct action in collaboration with others. Now, there is a place, don't get me wrong, there is a place for protest and opposition, absolutely. But we have to be aware, and we have to be open to a number of other ways of being. I think that we could listen, and we could speak our truth with power and with humility. Now, I've got a set of questions for you in small groups. I'm going to hand over to Joe. I'm going to encourage you to push back on what I've been saying. And I think we're going to be getting back together in half an hour where you can fire stuff at me. Joe.
Thank you, Paul.